I think we can get started here. So I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Berthoud to you today. He's the George H. Bray Professor here at Pennington, and he's housed in the Neurobiology and Nutrition Laboratory. Okay. His PhD was received from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, and he and his laboratory are interested in the role of the nervous system in maintaining energy homeostasis and intake. So you know that there's been a lot of kind of overlap in this semester in terms of the research that's going on. His laboratory studies maintaining energy homeostasis and intake, studies receptors and pathways controlling the peripheral nervous system in the brain, and also how they monitor internal metabolic state and availability of nutrients. And he's been funded by NIH for this work that uses behavioral, neuroanatomical, neurochemical, and electrophysiological approaches. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Well, thanks all for coming. So Thanksgiving week, but it looks like everybody is here. That's fantastic. Yeah, already, you mentioned already that I think just very recently you had Chris Morrison and Heike Mintzberg, and you know we closely collaborate. So I actually looked at their talks and tried to not have too many overlaps here. And you should be absolute experts now on how the brain controls food intake and energy balance, right? I mean, they showed you just about everything I could imagine. So, and also I think I did give you this paper to look at, this review paper. Did anyone actually look at it? I thought it's actually quite comprehensive, an attempt to suggest what's going on in this area. So, so first, this is really a good opportunity to me to actually get to know you. And many of you I do not know. I know Nicole, and I know you, but I couldn't even maybe say your first name. I mean, I know a few. I know who you are from seeing some, but some of you I actually don't know. So what I thought we do first is that you're going to all answer these two questions here. And first you say who you are, so I know who you are. And this can be very brief. So it's about, for me, you know, getting older and impatient with this whole obesity thing, I guess, maybe. You know, what's the cause of obesity essentially? What do you think is the most important mechanism causing obesity? You can be very brief. You can say lack of exercise or whatever you think is important. And then basically, how should we prevent and treat it? What do you think? Or I give you here maybe two things, because one is very difficult to do just one thing, right? You can say three or whatever. Anyway, you can basically say whatever you want, but because we are 10 people, we should limit it probably to about 1 minute per person.
I think we should start over
We
there.
start over there?
Sure.
I'm sorry to do that. But
That's all right. It's all right. I'm going to give
just to get you involved here.
My name's Tim Allerton, postdoc Jackie Stevens lab.
All right.
Training's in exercise physiology, so
All
I'm going
right.
to take the exercise route and say that my explanation for rapid development of obesity is in part due to lack of energy expenditure above metabolic rate. And what are two most important things you should do about it? This is all
You guys have the time to think about it.
I think we need to have more promotion of the actual interventions that we've developed in research. So getting out the actual methods out into the public and more.
Are you personally doing something that you think is important?
Well, yeah, so I spent a long time before I got my PhD in clinical practice and exercise physiology, working in the clinic, and actually bringing.
But you in your personal life, I mean, here.
Oh no, I
Huh?
yeah, so yeah, I'm studying adipocyte biology and exercise. So I'm looking at potential roles that exercise, beneficial things that exercise, and how we look at adipocytes and fat could be modulating that. So yeah, that's my personal contribution.
Okay, well, you do not seem to have any problem anyway. Nobody has any problem. Okay, good, next.
Nick Magazine. I'm a doctoral student in Jack Losso's lab. My training's in molecular biology.
In Jack?
Jack Losso with LSU campus.
Oh, I know him, I guess. Okay.
Yeah, so I'm trained in molecular biology, and I think that obesity is increasing because we're not evolutionarily prepared to handle the availability of calories that we have today. The span over which these things have become available doesn't match the span of typical evolution. So we have a prevalence of calories, and we don't have the tools developed to deal with that. And I think in terms of prevention, I think probably education and the availability of these high-calorie products are probably the two things that need to be looked into the most.
So you would raise taxes on
There's no great way to go about it, but honestly, if they're available, they're going to be used. So, and then my research has absolutely nothing to do with obesity. I study inhibitory RNA in use for autoimmune disorders. So.
Okay, well, the methods are used in obesity research.
Yeah, that's true.
Sure.
My personal contribution.
All right, right, thanks.
Hi, my name is Anita Morris. I'm also a graduate student in Dr. Losso's lab. I believe one of the reason why obesity is increasing is because the amount of processed foods that are out there that people are intaking. And I think one of the reasons, one of the things that we can do to kind of slow that down is educating more so like when people go to the doctor, instead of giving them a pill, letting them know kind of natural routes and how they can change their habits so that they can turn it around.
Okay, very interesting. Oui.
Postdoc in Hyper's lab. So I think obesity increase mainly because the increased calorie intake and the decreased energy expenditure. And although we know that there are many reasons that can cause obesity, like genetic composition, conception of obesity, gut microbiota, and medical practice, and sleeping duration and sleeping style. And for the two most important things I think we should do, I think first the two important are like calorie intake and exercise. Yeah, I agree with her, like education about how to how to change the lifestyle to a more healthy lifestyle.
All right, okay, very good.
Hi, I'm Doreen. I'm in Leanne's reference lab, but I'm also partner in vet school. And the main thing I'm working on now is a mouse model with preeclampsia. So a pregnancy disorder with hypertension. And I'm also working on studies or like data sets from studies about PCOS and bariatric surgery. I think obesity is increasing because the food that is there available to the general public, it's too much, it's too unhealthy, and everything that's healthy is so expensive. At least that's what I'm experiencing since I'm in the US. Everything that I would eat at home costs way more than everything else you can just easily buy. So I think, and it's of course exercising, there's not that many options here to bike and walk and run in nature. So I think the most important things to think of is education, telling people what's healthy, and finding a way that healthy food is more accessible to everyone.
Okay, I think that's very good.
I'm Jasper. I work with Leanne and Eric, and what I'm working on mostly, we were having a pregnancy study in which we follow obese women throughout pregnancy. And to answer this question, why is obesity rapidly increasing? I think because with respect to energy balance, I think it's energy intake, and because we're not only eating when our body tells us to eat, but when we feel like eating. And so at time points when it's not really necessary for our body to get that much of energy as we're putting in. And two most important things to think about, I think, yeah, the only way is to educate people and get these people to understand and want to lose weight, and not us telling them you have to lose weight.
All right, next.
Hi everyone, I'm Taiwan. I'm in Rob Nolan's lab, and we study skeletal muscle. So in my mind, I think the exercise only account for like 30% of the. I mean, if you want to lose weight, most people will focus on exercise, but actually it's food intake. It probably fits 70%. So I think the too much fast food restaurant and drive through a lot, and then so I think the most important cause of obesity, of course, too much food. I mean intake. I mean all calories.
So you also tend to favor the intake side of the expenditure.
Yes. So.
So what should we do about that? If we eat too much? Simply eat less?
We can work on that, but still we need to do some exercise, of course, and increase muscle mass, and increase.
But what would you do about
rate.
What would you do about eating less?
Eating less.
If that is
healthier.
the main culprit.
Eat healthier.
But how would you do that? How would you
How I do it?
Yeah. You just wake up and say, I eat less today?
Yes, yes. There's one way to do it, just you eat slowly, and
Okay, that's a new thing.
Eat
Eating
slowly.
slowly, chewing well, right?
Yes, chewing.
Good at that.
drinking slowly, yes. Yeah, I will do that.
And mindful eating, maybe?
Yes.
Mindful eating
Yes.
is one of these buzzwords that we hear more and more. Okay, interesting. Thanks. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, you haven't said.
Yeah, and probably eat too much turkey.
Uh-huh. Okay.
So I'm Tan Deng. I work with Berthoud, looking at regulating factor for adipocyte expansion. Like everyone said, I think it's the culture. Everything is more convenient, so people are less active. Food's more readily available, so they eat more. So I think the simplest solution, decrease intake and increase uptake. But I don't know how you would motivate people to do that, because.
Oh, motivation, the first time we hear motivation.
So
Another word in that.
To cure obesity, people would rather have a pill or something, so they don't have to actively.
So you think to motivate people is important. All right, it's a good point.
I'm Moses Napola. I work with Berthoud and Carmichael. I think the rapid increase, well, I would just say because we're measuring it now and focusing on it a lot more, so we tend to see the rise more prevalent. With regard to the measurement, then the second question is, well, then that, because we're measuring now, we have to pay more attention to the measurement of intake. In a sense that if you know what your basal metabolic rate is, you have to be aware of that and how much calorie intake you have on a daily basis, so you can restrict calorie to that.
All right.
How do you get people to keep doing those measurements? It can be all kinds of interventions that you can use to be awareness, the same thing in terms of education and how kind of people are not looking for those calorie intake. I try to make it.
All right, Nicole?
I'm Nicole. I work with Owen Carmichael and Corby Martin. So I
obesity is increasing mostly because of the energy density and palatability of the food that's available to us. There's so many calories in food that people don't really recognize the calories that are there. As far as intervening on it, I think we should reteach people how to only eat when they're hungry and to actually stop when they're full. I think that would go a long way as far as interoception teaching. And the other one that I was going to mention that I think is really underrated is intervening on people's sleep and making sure they sleep enough and they have good quality sleep.
Another new concept here, sleep.
Because sleep affects how active you are and the food-related decisions that you make. And so I think it could potentially be an important piece of the puzzle that's not studied as often.
All right.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kwan Rie. I work with Dr. Georgiana Turry at LSU, the main campus. I guess one of the reasons I feel like obesity is rapidly increasing is just kind of what everyone mentioned. As far as our culture and how things are more convenient, so we have easier access to energy-dense foods. And I guess as far as the two prevention methods, I would also say education is important, but I also think it's important to teach people skills such as like how to meal plan, how to actually portion out their food and what a portion looks like. Because just from some of the work that I've been involved in, I've noticed that a lot of people don't understand how much an ounce of meat is or how much an actual serving of grains is. So I think it's really important to educate people on those things, but also help them to develop the skills so that they can maintain that over their lifespan.
Okay, excellent.
Hi everyone, my name is Genesis Guerra. I work with Dr. Lamy Heath in the LSU campus. And basically I feel that obesity is increasing because here in America, or in the US, people understand that obesity is a disease. In our countries, like in Central America and other countries, people sometimes don't understand that obesity is a disease. They just think like they're healthy because they're big, or they look nice, and they don't actually understand that it's a disease. And I think one of the most important things is education, and also create awareness of people like that later in life or probably just in that moment can be a problem. And I think we can do more exercise. I'm trying to do it by myself actually. I work on the park today. I'm proud of that.
And you're doing very well. Very good. So Crystal, I guess we don't let you.
No.
You got the idea of what.
Fair treatment. So I'm Crystal Hill. I'm a postdoc in Chris Morrison's lab. And we study protein restriction and how that affects energy expenditure. Like I think you guys saw the PowerPoint. But a decrease in protein in diet increases energy expenditure as well as regulates weight. So what's the questions? Why is obesity increasing? Is that what we're going to?
Yeah,
Okay.
the first,
So,
basically two questions here
Okay.
that each.
I think obesity is increasing because of visual. Like, if you go in the grocery store, what's that eyesight? You see all the calorie-dense foods and not the nutrient-dense foods. Also, I like kids, and I think kids have a lot of effect on adults. So you know, your kid, when you're in the car in the afternoon, I know my daughter's always like, can we go to Sonics? And I'm like, girl, no, we're not going to Sonics today. And that's every day. So I think if we somehow educate kids, then we can educate adults. I think that's an effect.
All right. So, actually, I think that's about the best thing I've ever done in one of these seminars. That is enlightening. That is very enlightening. Very interesting. And, I mean, it does seem to be that the overwhelming agreement here is it's more on it's the control of food intake that you all think is probably the culprit. And I mean, I'm going to show you what, of course, I had the luxury to think a little bit about it. That would be the answers that I would give to these two questions. Again, it was a little brutal to push you here, but I actually think about it, and it's, you know, again, it came out probably also a little wishy-washy, but I think we have actually heard, basically, this idea over here. So this, what I think is this mismatch, there is a mismatch between the environment and the way our system was built to deal with food intake and energy expenditure. The system has evolved in a primarily restrictive environment. So of course, and we'll get a little bit later to that, it's all made that you are very efficient in using food. You're not wasting too much food, so there's not much of that. And you really react if you're hungry. You need to see the signals in the environment that indicate availability of food, so you respond to that. And of course, in an environment of plenty, this is not exactly a good thing. And but it's you see here, I think physical activity is also very important, even though we know you may be not able to lose a lot of weight by just running around the block every day. But I think it plays an important role in sensitizing some of these nutrient sensing mechanisms. And then, of course, there is also the genetic thing in there, the predisposition, as we will see a little bit closer of that. And so for me, you see, I told you I'm getting older, I'm getting impatient. You propose education. Haven't we been educated for years and years? Haven't we been educating our kids for years and years to do exactly all of this? Nothing happens. So I'm a little bit more desperate. And I think some of these problems in the environment should be changed at all costs, which even involves political decision and so on. Because in my view, it's overpowering people that obesity as a disease. It's a disease. Nobody would say if you have cancer or get cancer, oh, just get rid of your cancer. You can't do that. So for me, I think there is, I would go at the root problem. If you all think that's one of the root problems that we have, that this availability of energy rich, you go to the store, the visual signals and all that you mentioned, we need to fight this. And I'm also actually now would suggest that in certain individuals, bariatric surgery may be the best option. Because again, as you will see if we go through this, why should we actually let a lot of young people get obese before we treat them? Because some of these problems with obesity are not necessarily completely reversible. And people are miserable. Young children and adolescents are miserable being obese. So I'm arguing, why should we let that happen? Again, if we would know through to a genetic mutation or something that the child would get a cancer, and we would have a preventive treatment, wouldn't we hesitate to use it? Of course not. We would use it immediately. But in obesity, it seems like we always are wishy-washy, yeah, education and things like that. So you see, but that's probably just because you are still young and enthusiastic and think that I'm getting a little older, I'm getting a little less patient with the whole situation. So the first few slides is a little bit of going back to what you just heard the last two times, most of it from Heike and Chris. It's just that there is this homeostatic regulatory system. And this is really true. When Heike showed you these hibernators, how they can precisely regulate their body weight to the period of the short or long day, to that different level of body weight. And this is what we think is accomplished by this nutrient sensing system, very elaborate, that informs the brain, also other organs, which then determines energy intake and expenditure, which makes up, at the end, energy balance. And so there is this talk about this homeostatic regulator. We strongly believe and have evidence for that. That's in the hypothalamus, maybe brainstem. And it makes you defend a certain level of adiposity. And there are plenty of studies with temporary starvation or overfeeding, and then you stop it and you see that, you know, the reciprocal effect on food intake and energy expenditure to get you back on this defended level. And Chris, Heike probably, or Chris has told you about the fundamental aspect of this hypothalamic regulator. It became very clear when leptin was discovered that leptin is one of these feedback signals. So homeostatic regulation is primarily thought to be a negative feedback thing. So when the fat mass increases, leptin increases, it tones down the activity of these AGRP-NP-Y neurons in red. It decreases food intake here and anabolic processes. It has the reciprocal effect on these POMC neurons, and it also inhibits these POMC neurons. So together they put this fat mass back to less, so there is less leptin, and so on. So this is the negative feedback. Of course, this is in fact much more complicated. So you know, these two important groups of neurons here, they activate three branches, basically: the endocrine system, mainly through this parametrical nucleus; autonomic control, like muscle, adipose, some of you people working with, or a motor control; and then of course the behavioral control, and you see here that word motivation. So when you are starved for the day, the motivational system is very strongly activated and makes you find food and eat food, whether it's good or bad. You basically eat it. If you're long enough starving, you almost eat anything. And again, I think Chris may have shown you this. I mean, the power of this system is really demonstrated by recent these new methods in basic neuroscience, where you can silence particular types of neurons, or you can activate specific populations of neurons. And that's shown here. These AGRP neurons, when they are silenced with this diphtheria toxin, these mice stop cold licking for food here. So this is zero, and I think Chris showed you the body weight first time they have to kill these animals. They basically die. And you also, some of you probably heard just last Thursday we had this speaker in the seminar. He also showed very nicely what power these AGRP neurons have. If you, on the other hand, chemogenetically activate these neurons for here, like for four or 5 days, you can actually produce temporary obesity. And then when you stop the stimulation, they come back to that normal body weight. So these are very powerful, and there is no other area in the brain which you can stimulate or lesion where you see anything near these powerful effects. And so it's very clear that system is there. And it's also important that this system works largely outside awareness. So you are not conscious of its actions. So it's not very easy to bring it under cognitive control and just say, I don't do this, or I'm not going to do this kind of thing. It's not easy. And also, in the meantime, it's not just leptin, of course. It's a lot of gut hormones. It's nutrients like glucose, proteins were mentioned, other factors. I guess Chris told you about the FGF, fibroblast growth factor, and so on. And I think I'm going to skip this because we spent a little time. So, of course, there is a whole molecular machinery in these neurons, but I think Chris covered that. So the point of this is, so if we have this very powerful system, so why is it that obesity is rapidly increasing? And so we're going to look at a few possibilities. I think you mentioned them all in the introduction. Start with genetic alterations. Yes, leptin deficiency. You know a leptin deficient child is getting very obese at a young age, 60 kilogram here in this case, at 5 years. they eat about 4 times more than a normal child at that age. When they give them leptin treatment, it comes back to relatively normal body weight, almost normal food intake. So it's basically cured. So in this case, we know exactly what the cause is, and we can cure it. If you ban leptin, and obesity is cured. But that's the most simplest obesity, the monogenic. Unfortunately, in terms of genetic regulation, as you all know, there are relatively few genes that have a very high effect size. So leptin is way up here. It has a large effect size. But there are many genes involved, but most of them have a very, very little effect size. Except there are some genetics people talking about some undiscovered high effect genes that we don't know yet. We'll hear about that, I guess. I'm not so sure if we'll find a lot of those. So there has to be something else that's because there is only very few people that have leptin deficiency in the world, so something else has to be responsible. This is just to show that of these 120 now obesity genes, there is an overwhelming majority in the nervous system expressed from these very large HUEC studies with over, I think, 200,000 people in there. It shows that a lot is in the nervous system, and also a lot probably has to do with food intake, so you are probably correct that the regulation or the control of food intake is probably very important. So let's go on. Epigenetic. So we have at least a few people here that work with pregnant women. And so that's the, in the fetus, that's this vulnerable period in a fetus, in the offspring, where mechanisms can be changed without actually having different genetic background. It's really it's basically 3 factors. I'm not an expert in epigenetic population, and I think most of you have heard from our work in progress. But I mean, there are structural changes that can go on, which are not themselves epigenetic. There is also this the cellular aging concept, that is chromosome telomere length here. And then there is the real epigenetic. You can't probably read it here. The real 3 types, or whatever, the 3 epigenetic modifications, which changes what is, how the genes express themselves. So that is more and more recognized as very important. And it's shown that there are a lot of factors that influence this and make this, can produce epigenetic modifications, which is, if you go around here, aging, stress, drugs, eating habits, exercise, microbiome. So these are all different ways that we think that there is a lot of research done that look at this. To go on, so injury. There is, 50, 60 years ago, there were these VMH lesions in the ventromedial hypothalamus. You get a massively obese rat. There are actually people that have cancers, neoplasms in the area of the hypothalamus or brainstem, and they show exactly the same thing. They show obesity, sometimes very severe obesity, because it somehow acts on this hypothalamic regulator. What is more recently studied very intensively is this diet-induced inflammation. That's another theory. And I'll show you just 1 or 2 slides. This is from this Taylor and Michael Schwartz, probably know this. They look at these microglial specific markers, which is a marker for inflammation. And they show that just after 1 day of high-fat feeding, it's slightly increased. After 3 days, they have a significant increase in the number of microglia in the area of this hypothalamus, the arcuate nucleus, which is really the seat of these important neurons that we just talked about. And they show also that the fat mass gain, in a prospective sense here, they count this number of microglia, and the more microglia they find in a mouse or rat, they show that they gain more weight if they have a higher. So suggesting that it actually contributes to the obesity. It's probably not causing it directly, but it at least contributes once it's started to injury to the hypothalamus. They say that, you know, obesity is associated with neural injury in the brain area, crucial for body weight control, and that is true. But it's very controversial because many groups have shown that if you put these mice, in mouse studies, if you put the mice back on chow, they actually normalize, get back to the level of chow-fed control mice here. And looking at leptin sensitivity and the response of these HERP neurons to leptin or NPY, it's all normalized. So there doesn't seem any lingering effects of even having 20 weeks on high-fat diet here. And it has also been shown that actually even this inflammation, even Michael Schwartz has published a paper that when they do that, when they put them back on chow, it's pretty much normalized. It's not any longer significantly increased this number of microglia. So it's highly controversial. Yes?
I got a question. How long are they on high-fat diet, and then how long does he put them back on? Do you know how long they put them back on chow?
In this one here, I don't know, but here you see there were
okay.
about 20 weeks on high-fat and then another 15 weeks on chow or so. And I think probably if you wait long enough, there is possibly a point of no return where you cannot make everything reversible. And of course, they didn't look at everything here, so there are probably things that are not reversible.
So the adipose tissue in mice like that, I think we had a couple weeks ago, a speaker mentioned that the adipose was irreversibly damaged in the periphery, so in the, centrally it looks like it restores, but peripherally maybe not. But if you're showing that...
All right, there is maybe some dormant
weight
molecular change in there, and that's very interesting, that's very true. But by itself, it doesn't make them obese, they do get fat, okay, the body weight or energy balance phenotype. But it's a highly researched area. There are a lot of grant proposals. There are papers coming out. There was actually just a recent paper, I think, from the Matthias Chip group, which claims that it is actually sucrose responsible for this inflammation and not the high fat. Mm-hmm. Well, there you go.
Well, a high-fat diet isn't high in sucrose, is it?
Well, you have
yeah.
Western diet or the one that has mainly just high fat. So it depends also. Yes, I mean everything. It also depends on the fatty acid composition or the saturated fatty acids on. Yes. So yeah, I think that's great. Just ask questions. Okay, we are here to discuss. So that's great. I like that. So. Then, of course, what we had here, you see, I didn't even mention that, is environmental toxins, and I took that from your review. You looked at the review, they had it in there, very clear, right? These estrogen-like substances and pesticides and what kind of things. There are also people that believe viruses cause obesity, and viruses could affect the hypothalamus. But it's interesting, none of you took it so serious to actually say that's what I believe is the case. So we all are a little suspicious about that, right? But it's true that we cannot rule it out, of course. All right, so going on. That's more like How are we doing here? Wow, it's already 40 minutes or whatever. Huh? So we have another half hour maybe.
50 minutes.
Huh?
About 50 minutes, quarter to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, we just stopped if we are. We had enough. So that's more like, and actually that fits really more like what you guys were all thinking is going on here, right? It's that there is really nothing wrong with the homeostatic regulator. It just has not evolved to deal with the modern environment. This mismatch thing. In fact, as pointed out in the paper, the fact that the homeostatic regulator still works is the biggest problem. Because once you're obese, it defends that obese body weight level. That is true. That is really very strong to overcome. And here we have, different explanations. You all are familiar with the thrifty gene hypothesis. I don't think I have to elaborate on it. John Speakman, who originally was on board with that, some of you may know him, he then later has several papers where he thinks that cannot be it, there is not enough generations to produce this. And so he started to talk about the drifty gene or the drifting genes that are no longer defended against weight gain. It is predator. We go into this in a second. And again, the big issue here is really that this elevated body weight becomes homeostatically defended. So this thrifty gene environment mismatch theory, again, it originally was for obesity, coined by Prentice here, and John Speak and many others. Just for you people in the clinical area, that this similar theory has been recently, or this theory has been recently repackaged as food insecurity hypothesis. So you could argue people that live in a food insecure environment, it activates exactly these same mechanisms. Once they do get food, they tend to overeat, obviously. And so that could also be responsible. Again, this random drift settling point theory, that was explained by John Speakman, and he did experiments with weasels and voles, I think, in a field where he showed that when the voles that were the prey got too fat, they were easier to catch by the weasels. And so he thinks that probably in evolution, when man discovered fire and weapons and shelter, it was no longer object to predation, or not as much to predation. And so this pressure to keep body weight down, because when you had predators, if you couldn't run away, you were eaten up. That simple. And so, that slowly lifted, and so it's sort of a passive drift. It's in contrast to this more selective thrifty gene hypothesis, where there were selective genes that were picked out here. And I think this is all mentioned in this review paper. And then again, I think this non-genetic, whether it's epigenetic or not, these people called it here the maternal resource hypothesis. It's if you artificially select obese, inactive, metabolically compromised phenotypes that reproduce, you pass on that phenotype. And that seems to become a really important problem. It's not an easy way out of that. And then there are other people that understand it in a slightly different way, like this is from John De Castro. He had a paper which was called a general intake regulation model. He argued that there are compensated factors in terms of food intake. As we said, this would be the homeostatically regulated ones. And then there are uncompensated factors. And of course, these are, we already mentioned these homeostatic factors. uncompensated would be these non-homeostatic environment reward costs that we will have in a minute, a closer look at that, which are in a different area of the brain, usually controlled. And so that's why if a college student goes to college, it's this freshman, what is it, 15 pounds, or freshman 10 pounds or something, that David Levitsky told you if you went to his seminar about a month ago or whatever. You get, increase several pounds, and then you sort of start to defend that higher level. And of course, for me, the most clear-cut demonstration of all of this is simply the rodent DIO model. It works every time. It works perfectly fine. There you have a rat which on the chow has a normal, this is just growth-related increase in body weight. You expose them to what Sclafani, that was already more than 40 years ago, before there was any obesity society. Just exposed them to the supermarket diet. He gave them all kinds of Fruit Loops and whatever, And as you can see, these rats gained much, much more weight in a relatively short period of 2 months. And you can do it in mice, you can do it, you know it maybe from your cat or dog or, basically no species is preserved from that. And he already then, actually, for you that think exercise is important, it is important. Because he already there showed that if he had a cage where they have access to an exercise wheel, this was cut in half. So it is very clear that both these elements are key. The palatability, energy density, and variety of the food, easy availability, and the ability to do physical activity. Already shown more than 40 years ago very clearly. This is unambiguous. You could control everything in a rat or mouse experiment. There is the environment is the same, otherwise this is it. So, in addition to these internal signals that are used by the brain to make these decisions, is this environment and lifestyle. The availability is very important. If food is just lying around, we tend to just eat it. If we have work in progress and the cookies are there, of course we eat the cookie, The cost-reward ratio is important. If you have to work hard for it, you actually wouldn't eat a cookie. If you first would have to go across the street to get a cookie, you wouldn't do it. Of course, the palatability, taste, smell, as you said, vision also is not mentioned here, but of course, if you go to the store and see these, and in TV, the media show you all this. I don't have to tell you. The clock, yes, sleep, clock, diurnal cycle is important. Psychosocial factors, of course, and the built environment that determines the physical activity level. They're all important. And they all are modular, all of these processes. So first I should say all these external environmental stimuli interact with the brain, primarily with the cortex and limbic structures. And they're all modulated, also these, of course, the internal signals, by this genetic or individual predisposition, which can be genetic, epigenetic, or other early life events, as we have seen. So, again, I have put here this homeostatic regulator in blue. It's very important to notice this is completely unconscious, the homeostatic regulator. You're not aware how this acts. It's just like your blood pressure or anything. You're not aware of controlling that, or your blood glucose. So this is a big plot here that I show here in this red system. So that's a sort of a simplified, very simplified, and you may have other ideas how to show that, how this may work in the brain. So again, it basically starts with these external stimuli that interact with these respective sensory channels. Here you have your vision, smell, and taste. And then we have this large cortical area which basically stores representations of food and food reward. We have the amygdala, which is a sort of the emotional center, which determines emotional balance, whether you like something or don't like something or hate something. There is a reward calculation going on. And there is finally an executive control of the decision-making center in the brain. And they all interact, of course, through learning. Learning and memory is one of the major mechanisms by which we actually do almost any behavior. We learn from the past and we adapt it. So just to pick out, and so this system alone produces both conscious and unconscious actions that feed into these unconscious actions of the homeostatic regulator. And the question is of course, how exactly are these interactions taking place? But let me just give you a few examples of how we can visualize this. So again, there is an area in the cortex where you basically have food memories. So when you were in that your favorite restaurant and you had that favorite fish there, you remember what person was with you, what you drank with it, you know, whether you, anyway, you could tell me exactly everything about that event. And you could tell me, oh, that was good, that was a good fish, and the sauce was maybe a little this and that, and you have a memory of a food experience. And this is because all these sensory channels, smell, sight, sound, somatosensory, they feed through these respective channels you can show, and that's, I guess, what you see when you do your fMRI, when you show them pictures of food. You can show that some of these visual, the V1 through V4, that there is some activation, at least sometimes in these areas going in there. And they all seem to converge in an area of the cortex, which maybe one of the centers is the orbitofrontal cortex, which is in intimate connectivity or exchange with the cingulate cortex. And you can show that also from internal signals with taste. Actually taste here, which comes through some vagal and other nerves into the brainstem, and then through the thalamus, through the insula, feeds exactly in these same areas in the brain. You can show that also sensory information from the spinal cord here, so the dorsal root ganglia feeds exactly through the same channels. You can show that there is input from the hypothalamus, that some of it through the thalamus or directly also is represented in the insula, and then has access to the orbitofrontal cortex. And then we have circulating factors. So these are all neural inputs. You have circulating factors, they can affect practically every region in the brain here. So the point here is that you have these polymodal association areas in the brain, and that's exactly what we need to have one of these memories, which has everything. What was the friend at that dinner? What was the food? What was that? You associate everything with everything. That makes one of these food memories. And of course, this area is in heavy contact with the memory functions, hippocampal complex, with the reward circuitry that we will see in a second, and also this decision-making area of the brain. And so let's pick out reward value and salience. I think that's maybe one of the most crucial also, because as I tell you, if you starve for a day or two, you have very high incentive motivation to eat food. You are very aware of food around you. You want the food. You want it, even if it's not tasting very well. You're very strongly driven to food. And again, this is a non-conscious event. This is beyond. It's a feeling, it's like, I don't know how to explain it, but it's not something you can just make it go away. You can maybe learn to modulate it a little bit. And, you know, reward functions, as you know, other people have very nicely sort of like classified these. This is the Kent Berridge sort of classification scheme. It suggests there is a liking, which is basically the pleasure, hedonic impact of a food. There is wanting, or the more willingness to work for food. It's the wanting here. And then, of course, they are tied together with learning mechanisms. You learn about that. You can like something without wanting it. If you were just satiated with chocolate, you still wouldn't say, I don't like chocolate. You still like chocolate, but you don't want it now because you just had it. You can also dissociate wanting from liking, and Kent Berridge shows this with some support from the addiction literature. An addict, they constantly want this missing, they want this drug, even though they don't like it. At the point they actually hate to do that to themselves, but they want it. They are driven to do it. Another interesting is, and it has been mentioned, I don't know who mentioned it, habitual food intake. Habits, it becomes habits when we look for food and so on. It becomes habitual, and that has to do with this procedural memory or habits, which is a function of these striatal loops in the dorsal striatum particularly, which is very different from an episodic or emotional memory. These memories are, again, totally subconscious. An episodic memory, yes, you can recall it immediately, you can tell me what you experienced, but this procedural memory that controls habits is not, and that is illustrated by this observation here. Remember when the guy in Lausanne talked about this? That's where I got the idea for this slide. Anyway, Eric, what was his name? The famous memory, Eric Kandel, the famous memory person here. He gave a talk at one of these meetings that Lamy and I had frequented a few times in Lausanne, the Nestle Symposium. And he talked about this, and I checked it out, and it's very interesting. There was a quite well-known British pianist, Clive Warren, and he had, due to an encephalitis through viral origin, he had the worst case of severe amnesia, despite being acknowledged by doctors as having one of the most severe cases of amnesia due to meningitis. His musical ability and much of his musical memory was intact. So he could still, without having any notes or whatever, he could still play the piano. It was completely intact, but he could not remember what you told him 10 seconds ago. A very severe memory loss. So this just shows that these memories are very differently organized. And again, if it's this habitual memory, it's not something that you can cognitively control very easily. And relearning, apparently relearning in humans is one of the most important things, most difficult things for humans to do. To lose bad habits and learn better new ones. It's apparently very, and I guess I can see it on myself. It's one of the very difficult things to do. It's not as easy as we think. All right, finally, executive control, decision making, just to give you an idea of what might be going there. So there you're faced with this decision. Originally it was an apple and orange, but I think that's what we're talking more like here. Apple or that delicious cake. And so it turns out, again, that has been done with fMRI studies, that you can actually map into this prefrontal cortex areas which indicate the goal value of each of these individual subjects. So basically you have stored value of how valuable is an apple to you or this chocolate cake. Then there is a decision value, which sort of is like the difference between these two, calculates the difference, and on the basis of which you make the difference. And of course the child every time it will go for this because it's just, yes, it's more, And then there is also in the ventral striatum we have this idea of a prediction error. So this is the idea that, let's say, you know, the apple was actually rotten. Of course, then you memorize that. The next time you look at an apple, you say, last time it wasn't so good. Maybe I shouldn't eat that apple. So you update your memory on anything. So when the next time comes, you use that updated. Although this is just a slide to illustrate how some of these actions these decisions, why they may be in the unconscious, in the unawareness control. So this was, I think, so title here is Decoding the Outcome of Decisions Before and After They Reached Awareness. So it was like a button press paradigm again with fMRI. And I think what we should focus here is this red line is when the subject was aware of its own choice. They determined that with the way they pressed these buttons. What you would expect is how the motor cortex behaves. That only after you get aware, you sort of like reach your motor cortex will now do a certain function. That's what you would expect. But in fact, there are several brain areas where you have quite considerable neural activity way before you are aware of your own decision to choose this or that. Here and here in these areas. So basically these researchers concluded when the subject's decision reached awareness, it had been influenced by unconscious brain activity for up to 10 seconds. So it's not necessarily your conscious realization, there's something like something else in yourself that prepares you to make that decision. And so that's what I think happens in a nutshell, that we have this very powerful system, particularly this behavioral control through HRP, and you have seen these mice just last Thursday. Put that blue light on, that mouse eats and eats and eats. It's really fascinating. And that's what you do. You turn on this incentive motivation, this wanting response. That's why it goes. He showed he had to lever press for that food more. And still went there and pressed the lever. So he was willing to do work for it. And I think that's what happens. The obesogenic environment plays right into this. It sort of shortcuts this system. It hijacks this system, I call it. Maybe through these thrifty genes or drifty genes or whatever. But it taps into this powerful system, and so it's very difficult to suppress that if the environment is conducive for that. And we could argue about this hedonic feedback to these neurons, but let's not go into that. But again, the important part here is that most of the underlying neural processes take place outside awareness and are difficult to bring under cognitive control. So, somebody last May formulated my feelings quite well with this quote here. The history of the past century is one of staggering social, cultural, and environmental change, and all that change has been obesogenic. That's still very mild, but then, and we heard that in America they do this, and in America they do that, right? See, he says, and he is American. America willfully propagates obesity for profit, then spends taxpayer money to explore the mysteries of the obesity epidemic. It's not completely wrong, I think. Because all this advertisement and thing is basically driven by the corporate world, obviously. And they make a lot of money in it. And so I know we cannot change this back, but I think we can try to get a few changes, at least a few key changes. I think they are really necessary. So just to conclude, so in the last 10 minutes or so, I have about 10 minutes, right? I will then show you what I think we should do for prevention or treatment. But this is just to conclude from this, anyway, body weight is defended against too little or too much. There is no fixed set point. Weight loss is more strongly defended against than weight gain. Low leptin and other signals of low nutrient availability act mainly on the brain to stimulate appetite, reduce energy expenditure. Besides the hypothalamus, they engage the powerful brain motivational system. I haven't really shown you that. This bottom-up modulation of these hormones of the hedonic brain. Maybe we can do that some other time. So obesity, the obesogenic environment and lifestyle are the main modifiable risk factors for obesity in genetically and metabolically prone individuals. And that's why if we realize that that is the cause, we should actually treat, do treatment or prevention by removing the root cause. I mean, that would be the best. Obesity is inevitable when the higher level of body weight adiposity is biologically defended. And that's one thing the mechanisms that work here, we just don't understand. We can see that, that hypometabolism when you lose a lot of weight, like in The Biggest Loser, but how that changes the brain and how that becomes the new defended level, those mechanisms we don't know. And that would be, I think, very, very important to know. And again, that's maybe my pessimistic view here. Significant changes in environment and lifestyle are unlikely in the near future. I mean, under these political circumstances, I'm not too much of an optimist that this is it's going to change very soon. So what do we have really? If we don't do anything, we just continue on this increase in the obesogenic environment. Dieting and lifestyle, yes, I'm absolutely for it. And I actually would say if we would put the same budget into research on finding out what you said, education, awareness and all this, if we would put the same budget as these companies put into making you buying their food products, we probably wouldn't have the crisis. Because these are billions and billions. And NIH has a total budget of what, 33 billion? I mean, it's ridiculous basically as to what is spent on producing the mess. What we are trying to get us out of the mess is really ridiculously small. It's disappointing. And there are really good studies. I found one study where they had, after 1 year, an 18% weight loss. It was starting with a very low calorie diet for 12 weeks or something, and then just very heavy counseling and making sure. And so the problem is, of course, after that year, right? And you know what happens if you then let them go, and so most of them will come back, and that's the problem. Drugs. The drug companies would love, of course, to have children taking from 10 years on to their death a pill, right? That costs quite a bit of money just to not get obese or to prevent, or not get further obese. And we have some drugs, and I'm not saying we shouldn't use it in all obese people, but again, we should go beyond that. There is also a little bit of The new generation of drugs, which are these combination of drugs, which we didn't go into, is maybe more powerful, because till now these drugs only address one particular pathway. And so in this system, which is so redundant, of course, the other pathway compensates. You know, it's just like if you do exercise, you eat more food. So you would have to have exercise and something on the intake side, which would be much more powerful. In terms of drugs, you want to affect not just intake, also expenditure, or you want different aspects of more homeostatic signals and hedonic signals maybe at the same time, and so on. So there is some promise there, and you know, there is possibility that we find a much better drug that has not so many side effects, which of course could be very valuable. But after I have been now looking for about, well, it's now 9 years when we started our project with gastric bypass surgery, that's clearly the most effective. And you know what happens with this gastric bypass surgery. We make a very, very small gastric pouch, and we divide the small intestine here, cut it, take the lower part up to this pouch, so that nutrients now flow through this little pouch and then through this, what is called the root lymph here, directly in the lower intestine. And so you have this empty stomach, empty duodenum. You need this, of course, so that the bile acids and the pancreatic juices are still mixed with the food later down there. But it is very effective, as you see from this Swedish study, which was not randomized, and, but it pretty much is now over 20 years, and people still after 20 years are fine. There is just a 12-year study just came out in New England Journal of Medicine, and you see how close these points actually are. So it's actually remarkably reproducible. And it works in about 70 to 80% of patients, not in all. Initially they have weight gain, but a lot of weight loss, but many of them do have weight regain. But I think it's very good. In 70 to 80% who have this sustained decrease, there's also the glycemic control, of course, diabetes remission. You know, the quality of life is just very different. Yes, there are complications, and I'm certainly not saying there are none, but actually the mortality rate in humans with this surgery is less for any other major surgery. So if you have any cardiovascular, any other major surgery, then it's more likely to die on this. And in a way, it's quite attractive, the idea that, okay, we have this environment, we have too much food, we eat too much food. Well, this GI tract, you know, the absorptive surface is larger than a tennis court, the total absorptive surface of the gut. That was good if you needed that to get every little bitty of food absorbed. But with this surplus, this is probably not very good to have this enormous surface. So in a way, it makes a lot of sense. Just cut down on this gut capacity to absorb foods. It's not, it's basically a simple idea. And so, you know, I think it's important. So, and what we had just show you 2 more or 3 more slides. Is that okay?
Yeah, no, you're fine.
All right. If you have questions, you interrupt. So, and you have probably seen some of these before. Here we have shown that, so a lot of people think this bariatric or gastric bypass surgery, Roux-en-Y, is sort of a physical restriction. These people are poor, they just can't eat more. It's like having a wire in front of the mouth that they can't eat, really. But this is not really the case. And here in a rat model, we have shown that we have done RYGB here, and so they lost weight, regained a little bit here, but they were still much lighter than those sham-operated animals. And then we infused for 2 weeks in the brain one of these HUEC, which is a melanocortin-4 receptor antagonist, which is known as the strongest appetite-stimulating drug in a mouse or rat. It had also been used in humans, but for some reasons the drug didn't make it because it had other effects. So when we did that, you see these rats, they all of a sudden started to eat twice as much and gained weight. They actually surpassed the sham animals here. They got obese again. And when the infusion stopped, then slowly they came back to this level of the saline infusion here. And they did that by increasing meal frequency. So it is true that they cannot eat much bigger meals because of this very small pouch. So there is a restriction in the sense that in a given meal they cannot eat a huge amount. But they easily go around that by just eating more frequent small meals. That's what they do here. A normal sham-operated rat, if you give them that drug, it's not shown here, they also eat more and gain more weight, of course. But they do it exclusively by doubling meal size and not meal frequency. So they just use another strategy, the RIGB. But it's not that they cannot eat large amounts of food, so they can do that. So it's more like some physiological mechanism that makes them defend or settle at the lower level of body weight. And this is our mouse model. So we wanted to get the mouse model for this surgery so that we could use all the genetics tools, of course, to interrupt specific pathways that we are thinking are important for the beneficial effects of this surgery, right? So so this is the mouse model. Again, we usually make these animals fat first. So on chow, these mice are here 26 grams. We fatten them up before the surgery here to over 40 grams. Most of it is increased fat. And then we do the surgery, and you can see here the surgery cuts down. There's a little bit of regain, but out to 12 weeks, it's quite nice suppression. Sham surgery has just a temporary effect, and then they gain weight. We always also run a weight match group, which we just calorie restrict. So it doesn't have any surgery, but we give them less food to get that drop in body weight. Because there's a big questions are, what part of this surgery is due to weight loss and what is due not to other than weight loss independent mechanisms. And well, this is just the food intake. So, and importantly, well, I probably should show you the food intake. In the mouse, the food intake after about 10 days recovers actually back to normal levels like the sham animals. And this is different from humans. Humans seem to, even after 20 years, eat less. Mice, they initially eat less, but then they come back up. There is some energy loss in the feces, particularly on a high-fat diet. Of course, there is some fat loss in the feces. We didn't measure that here. It's usually about 2 to 3 calories. So in fact, if we subtract these 2 to 3 calories, they actually do absorb a little less than the sham-operated mice. But importantly, they also increase energy expenditure. Not compared to the sham-operated, but compared again to this weight match, and that demonstrates how important it is to run this weight match group. So the weight match and RIGB have the same body weight. So we can correct this. We don't really have to, with energy expenditure, always the question, how do you correct it to lean mass or to total body mass, to whatever. People have different formulas. Well, having the weight match and RIGB the same way, that actually doesn't matter, but you can see whatever we do, compared to these weight matched, RIGB have significantly higher energy expenditure. And this is maybe about 15% shown here on this correlation plot with lean mass here. So probably it's a combination of this relative increase in energy expenditure and maybe a slight decrease in absorbable nutrients from the gut. So again, it seems to at least prevent the adaptive hypometabolic response to calorie restriction. So the last two slides are really a new, and you will see that I'm also giving, I think next Tuesday, my work in progress, and then focus more on that. You will have a little preview on this. And, this is, I think, these are my or our most exciting data. So we turned the whole thing and we said, okay, let's do the surgery before these mice are obese, when they eat normal chow diet. Right? Is that possible to do? And we did that here in female mice. We did it at 5 weeks of age. Very young mice. 16 gram were these mice. But thanks to Zheng Hao, you have probably seen him around, he is just absolutely amazing microsurgeon under the microscope. He can do an RYG, a gastric bypass surgery, in a 16 gram mouse. And none of these died. There's no mortality here. You can see that initially they actually lose a little weight, yes, but that's just, there is some trauma with this surgery. But after 10 weeks, there was no significant difference between RIGB and sham, and also we had a group with no surgery. So they were all fed on sham. And I think that's important. If you are completely lean, a gastric bypass surgery should have no effect, because making you even leaner, no, there's no point doing that. If you are lean, you are just perfect. And so I think most of these mice on chow, they are just perfect. So 2 or 3 weeks later, we then hit them, so there's no difference from week 7 significant. So 2 or 3 weeks later, at about 20 weeks of age, we then hit them with the environmental change, which was high-fat diet, right? We turned it around. We didn't fatten them up and reversed obesity. In this case, we're trying to prevent obesity. And if we continue on chow, that's what the normal chow-fed mouse does, no surgery. It just goes along, it gains a little bit over 16 weeks. We have pulled that out now over 40 weeks, actually. And if we put them on high-fat diet, as I've shown in the cafeteria diet, that's what they do, mice and rats. They gain weight and they get obese. And it's all fat, as you will see. They gain fat. Now, if we take sham-operated animals on high-fat, they also do exactly that. The question is, the one that had RIGB, what are they doing? And it's just, it's just amazing. They are just completely protected from developing obesity, even though they are eating high-fat diet. 16 weeks, we have pulled that out to 40 weeks. Even 40 weeks of this environmental power of this challenge cannot make them obese. They have, the fat content is very similar to the chow-fed mice. You see, these animals have 16 to 18 gram fat. They are severely obese. I think that's just absolutely fascinating. And of course, the glucose tolerance is, in this case, the insulin sensitivity is, of course, restored or is not disturbed. So resistance to diet-induced obesity is conferred in absence of any acute non-specific effects of the surgery. This suggests a change in defended body weight. And how do they do that in terms of energy balance? So if you put a normal mouse from this chow on high fat, on the first day you can see how they pig out. Really, they more than double intake in calorie-wise, as you see here. And then after 10, 20 days, they zero in here at about 20 to 30% more than a chow-fed animal in calories. Now, the RIGB are not completely immune to that, and that's not too surprising. That would have been even, I mean, then I would have started to, well, there's something funny going on. So they do like it also, and they do it more, but only about half. But at 20 days, they're actually very close, not significantly different here. So over all this period, they are sort of in the middle between Chan and chow fed animals. So how can it be that they can constantly eat more food here over the long run and still have the same body weight? Well, again, it's in the energy expenditure, which is shown here. The chow versus RIGB, again, the body weight is not different, the body composition is not different. And in either, even uncorrected or per lean mass, whatever, it's about 15 to maybe 20% higher in the RIGB than in the chow-fed mice. So we think it's a combination of not eating quite as much, at least initially of the high-fat diet, and what keeps them really down there is to also slightly increase energy expenditure, which really suggests that they sort of defend at a different level of adiposity. So to summarize, RIGB in adolescent mice on normal chow diet does not interfere with normal growth. That's important to realize. RIGB in adolescent mice almost completely prevents diet-induced obesity and associated impairment of glycemic control later in life. Protection is achieved by a combination of reduced energy intake and increased energy expenditure. And so, yes, I mean, I guess my conclusion would be that in the absence of any serious attempt to stop the willful propagation of obesity for profit, RIGB, even in children and adolescents with a high predisposition to develop obesity and diabetes later in life, in this obesogenic environment should be considered at least. So you see, I'm arguing why should we get these children and adolescents obese first before we do something about it? I know this is probably, you know, nobody will do this. It's still very controversial to do RIGB surgery on children. But anyway, I'm being a little bit provocative here. And so maybe you can tell me that will never happen. Anyway, that's I think all I had to tell you. Yeah, so actually I haven't put the new student workers on this slide. I've got to update this slide. But anyway, so if you have questions, please, we have maybe 2 more minutes.
Just about what?
Maybe one quick question. Did you, your normalization for energy expenditure, did you do that also by regression, or did you take ratios? Energy over body weight?
Yeah, you've seen on one thing we did this regression, you know, and we do that normally now. It's ANCOVA regression that they recommend at the phenotyping, Vanderbilt phenotyping thing site. They have a formula for that. So, but anyway, usually, you know, I've started to put in my papers all different ways of normalization because everybody likes a different way. And if you put one, they say you should put that one. So you keep it to them. So, any other questions? Yeah.
What about, any thoughts on macronutrient composition? You're saying that in one group, high sucrose is thought to be one of the regulators of energy intake. What about high insulin? I know that was a common thought once in a while at Harvard that high insulin levels promoted increased energy intake. Is that still thought to be the case?
Well, you know, so you're alluding, I guess, to this whole carbs driving insulin and then insulin driving insulin, making sure that the energy goes into fat, so it's not available for oxidation. That constitutes sort of a hunger signal, and so the tendency is to eat more. There is literature to support that, but I think the tests from Kevin Hall and other people that have done this kind of study, they just cannot really show that very well. You know.
But is there differential regulation between something like a ketogenic diet compared to?
Yeah, I think the general consensus is that in terms of energy balance, a calorie is a calorie, pretty much. But of course, in terms of other effects, you know, I'm sure there is, you know, all these different nutrients and fatty acids, and so they have some different effects. But in terms of energy balance, there is no good demonstration. I mean, they have done these trials here, right? George Bray and other people, where they pretty much showed that at the end it's the amount of calories,
Sure.
whether you get that from carbs or fat or whatever, it doesn't really matter that much. So, but I think it's a very interesting idea in terms of inflammation. This will also be interesting because some people think it's really the high fat, and others, as I said, some now they think it's sucrose, who knows. One thing with these mice, at the very end, we actually gave them a choice between the high-fat diet and liquid sucrose, because there is some literature that this, if you give them that choice, which is in a tube versus not in one pellet, so they basically love to take a little high-fat and then it's, I guess, just like eat the hamburger and then a little Coke, right, and you know, mix it up and so on. That makes them even super obese, even more obese. So we had actually these females here in the last month or so on that diet, and didn't make any difference. They didn't get obese. They were still completely protected. And some did like a little bit more sucrose, some more the high fat and so on. Didn't seem to make a difference in terms of them not getting obese if they had the surgery, and getting obese if they didn't have the surgery. So.
But what would you expect the result to be if you were to use a mouse model that was genetically predisposed to obesity? Would you expect that same gap, the difference?
So we did that in the OB mouse, which is the leptin deficient mouse. We published that 2-3 years ago. So what happens is that these OB mice, they get very obese, as you know. And so we have done it actually at 2 ages of the OB mouse. They do not lose as much weight with the surgery, but sort of the distance between the sham operated animals also gain more weight. So the difference between the sham operated and the RIGB is basically preserved just at the higher level. They just continue to gain a lot more weight and get more obese. So yes, it's sort of partially required for the full effect of RIGB, but it's not the key factor. That normally you would want to see that if you hit the key factor, you want to see that the RIGB has no effect and meets the sham operated after, 2 weeks or whatever, right? That would be the pure demonstration that that is the fact, the missing fact. Or that is the mechanism by which RIGB is working. And so, because of this just parallel going up, it's difficult to interpret.
What do you think drives the increased energy expenditure if it's not leptin?
That's a good question. This must be that's a good question. We should focus on that, I guess. It could be anything. I mean, you make a lot of changes in the gut. So there are all different gut hormones and other factors that change. We have You know, we have, for example, also done this in the FGF21 knockout mouse. Unfortunately, there we didn't see a difference in the effectiveness because FGF has been shown to activate brown fat and so on. But there are other factors from the gut that would be responsible for that.
Is the thermal cost of digestion increased? I'm sorry, jump ahead, is the thermic effect of food increased in Rouen?
There is in humans actually, there is one study showing exactly that.
Yeah.
But the total amount is very small there,
Yeah.
and so it's very difficult to, from the basis of that, to say that it's important in humans. Normal energy expenditure in humans is very controversial, and most studies do not find that increase that you find in the rodent. So we haven't measured it specifically in the mouse, those different, you know, the effect of food intake, so we haven't separated that. But we do normally measure our energy expenditure at thermal neutrality just to make it more sensitive. Because if you keep a mouse, as you know, normally at 22, that's too cold for a mouse. I mean, they basically have to produce a lot of energy just to keep warm. And so on top of that energy expenditure, to see differences is more difficult, so we find it easier at thermal neutrality. But, you know, we haven't in detail looked exactly. And, you know, what it is, yeah, that would be interesting, I think, very interesting. If you have an idea, let me know. What kind of knockout mouse we should use, you know.
I mean, I would just know a few hormones in humans that correlate with energy expenditure.
Right.
What's the RQ look like? Are they,
Oh my gosh.
because if they're, you know, you get to
Yeah.
the bottom, if they're increasing the carbohydrate oxidation compared to their fat oxidation, is likely the fat oxidation.
The RQ, I can't tell you exactly right now what those, we're not huge differences normally. We normally look at the difference between the knockout and the wild type in all these models, and there usually we don't see an effect. But just compared to the weight match, that's also a good question. I think, no, I'm not sure. They're both on high fat, of course, so they do burn a lot of fat. But I have to look at that. And so, yeah, you know.
So let us thank you for the presentation. Those who still have questions can stay, I think, and you'll address them.
Right.
If anyone needs to leave,
Yeah,
sure, or
sure.
whatever.
And anyway,
That's
I
what
will
I'm
be
trying to
next
say.
Tuesday, I will have my work in progress, so that, you know, would be also quite welcome to ask questions. So, well, thank you.
No, thank you.
Thank you.